When Alara began stacking stones at the edge of the valley, people stopped to watch, not out of curiosity, but amusement. The village had always built with wood, cabins, barns, fences. Stone was considered heavy, slow, and unnecessary. Winter came every year, and wood had always been enough. Or so they thought. Alara worked alone. No hired hands, no help from neighbors. She chose each stone carefully, testing its weight, its balance, its resistance. Her hands cracked in the cold, autumn air, but she never rushed. "She's building a tomb," someone joked. "She'll freeze before it's finished," said another. Alara said nothing. She just kept building. The hut didn't look impressive at first. Low, thick-walled, almost windowless. But every detail had a purpose. The walls were layered stone, packed tight with clay and gravel to stop wind from slipping through. The roof curved slightly downward, designed to let snow slide instead of piling up. The entrance faced away from the valley's strongest winter winds. Inside, the space was small but efficient. A raised stone platform for sleeping, narrow vents for smoke and airflow, a fire pit carved directly into the rock floor. Alara wasn't building for comfort. She was building for survival. The first snow arrived weeks ahead of schedule. At night, the wind howled through the valley, rattling wooden walls and bending old trees. Roofs creaked, doors slammed. People reinforced shutters and prayed winter wouldn't be worse than usual. From her stone hut, Alara listened. The walls didn't shake. The wind didn't whistle inside. The cold stayed outside. Still, the villagers laughed when they saw smoke rising slowly from her stone chimney. "Let's see how that pile of rocks holds up in a real storm," they said. It came without warning. Snow fell sideways, driven by violent wind. Visibility vanished. Temperatures dropped fast, far lower than anyone remembered. Wooden cabins groaned as ice formed in their seams. Roof beams snapped under the weight of snow. Some families fled to neighbors' homes. Others burned through firewood faster than planned. And then silence. The wind became too strong to hear anything else. Through it all, Alara stayed inside her hut. The stone absorbed the cold slowly. The fire burned steadily. The structure didn't move. Outside, the blizzard tested everything. When the storm finally passed, the valley looked broken. Collapsed roofs, fallen fences, snow-buried paths and doorways. People dug themselves out, stunned by the damage. Then they noticed something. At the edge of the valley, standing exactly as before, was Alara's stone hut. No cracks, no collapsed roof, no damage at all. Smoke rose calmly from the chimney. For the first time, no one laughed. They just stared. By midday, villagers gathered near the edge of the valley. They didn't approach the hut right away. They circled it instead, examining the walls, touching the stone as if expecting it to crumble under their fingers. "How is it still standing?" someone whispered. Alara finally stepped outside. Her coat was dusted with snow, her face calm, almost unreadable. She didn't explain. She didn't boast. She simply nodded and began clearing snow from her doorway. That silence unsettled them more than any explanation could have. Over the following days, people returned again and again. They measured the thickness of walls. They traced the curve of the roof with gloved hands. They noticed how the hut sat slightly below ground level, protected from direct wind. Slowly, laughter turned into curiosity. A carpenter admitted his cabin nearly collapsed. A farmer confessed he'd lost half his livestock to the cold. For the first time, they wondered if stone had been the smarter choice all along. Winter wasn't finished. Dark clouds rolled in again, heavier than before. The air grew sharp and still, the warning signs everyone feared. This time, panic spread faster. People reinforced doors, stacked firewood, and checked roofs. Some glanced toward Alara's hut, uncertain but hopeful. As snow began to fall again, one family made a decision. They knocked on Alara's door. Alara opened the door without hesitation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "I told you so." Inside, the stone walls radiated warmth. The fire pit glowed softly, and the air felt steady, unchanging, even as the wind outside began to scream. More people arrived before nightfall. By the time the storm reached full force, the hut sheltered more than just its builder. Children slept on stone platforms wrapped in blankets. Adults sat quietly, listening to the storm fail again and again. The blizzard raged. The hut endured. When morning came, the storm retreated like a defeated enemy. The valley was damaged again, but fewer homes were lost this time. People had prepared better. They had learned. And they had learned from Alara. Standing outside her hut, villagers spoke differently now. Their voices were lower, thoughtful. No one laughed. No one doubted. They finally understood. Alara hadn't built a strange shelter. She had built the future. After the second storm, winter felt different. The cold was the same. The snow was just as heavy. But fear no longer ruled the valley. People walked with purpose now. They reinforced weak walls, sealed gaps, and studied the way wind moved between buildings. For the first time, survival felt like something they could plan, not just endure. At the center of it all stood Alara's stone hut, quiet and unchanged. Alara never offered lessons. Still, people learned. They watched how the hut stayed warm without excess firewood. They noticed how the stone released heat slowly through the night. They saw how snow slid off the roof instead of crushing it. Soon, small changes appeared across the valley. Stone foundations replaced wooden posts. Lower walls replaced tall, fragile frames. Entrances turned away from the wind. The village began to transform, one decision at a time. Spring was still far away, but cooperation arrived early. Neighbors who had once mocked Alara now worked side by side. They shared tools, carried stone, and reinforced one another's homes. What had started as survival became community. Alara joined when asked. She lifted stones. She adjusted angles. She spoke only when necessary. Her strength wasn't loud. It was precise. Late in the season, the worst storm of all appeared. Winds stronger than before. Snow deeper than anyone remembered. Cold that burned the lungs. This time, the valley didn't panic. People gathered in reinforced homes. Fires were managed carefully. Stone and wood worked together instead of fighting each other. The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, the valley still stood. As the snow slowly melted, the damage was minimal. The hut still stood at the edge of the valley, unchanged, unmarked, patient. Children played near it now. Adults paused beside it, thoughtful. The stone hut had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about building something that would last. Long after laughter faded. Long after storms passed. The first signs of thaw were subtle. Water dripped from rooftops. Snow softened underfoot. The valley breathed again after months of tension. For the first time since winter began, people thought about the future instead of the cold. Alara repaired nothing. Her hut needed no fixing. Travelers passing through noticed the changes. They asked why stone huts dotted the valley now. Why homes sat lower, tighter, stronger. The villagers pointed toward Alara's hut. They told the story of laughter. They told the story of storms. They told the story of the blizzard that failed. And the story kept moving, far beyond the valley. Alara stood outside her hut one evening, hand resting on the cold stone. She knew wood rotted. She knew storms returned. Stone meant commitment. It meant choosing effort now over regret later. Others in the valley had begun to understand that truth. Not because they were told, but because they had lived it. No monument was raised. No plaque marked the hut. But new generations grew up knowing its shape, its strength, its purpose. Children learned where to stand when the wind came. They learned why roofs curved, why walls stayed thick, why patience mattered. The hut taught without words. Years later, winter returned as it always did. Snow fell. Wind howled. But no one feared it the way they once had. The stone hut still stood at the edge of the valley, unchanged, unbroken, unquestioned. And the laughter that once echoed there, it was buried beneath layers of snow and time. The harshest winter came years later. Older, wiser villagers recognized the signs early. The air sharpened. The animals moved differently. Snow fell heavier, faster. This time there was no doubt. They trusted what had proven itself. Stone homes filled with families. Fires were controlled, not wasted. The valley prepared, not with fear, but with certainty. At the edge of it all, Alara's hut waited. The storm arrived with force unmatched by memory. Wind slammed against walls. Snow buried paths completely. Even reinforced homes groaned under pressure. But nothing failed. Stone absorbed the impact. Roofs shed snow. Heat stayed trapped inside thick walls. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the valley emerged intact. The lesson was complete. No celebration followed. Instead, one by one, people visited Alara's hut. They brought bread. They brought tools. They brought nothing at all, just silence and respect. Alara accepted none of it with ceremony. She only nodded, the same way she had years ago when no one believed. Alara grew older, slower, steadier. The hut never changed. Long after her footsteps softened and her voice faded, the structure remained, solid, patient, unmoved by time or weather. It outlived storms. It outlived doubt. It outlived the laughter that once surrounded it. The valley never forgot. Generations later, the story was still told, not as a warning, but as wisdom, about building for what will come, about trusting knowledge over noise, about choosing strength when it's easier to follow the crowd. And at the edge of the valley, the stone hut still stood, unbroken, unchallenged, unloggable. The day Alara's hut stood empty, the valley noticed. No smoke rose from the chimney that morning. No footsteps crossed the packed snow near the doorway. The stone walls remained unchanged, but something felt different. People didn't speak of loss loudly. They understood that some presences don't disappear. They settle into the land itself. Years passed. Surveyors, builders, and travelers stopped by the stone hut, not to admire it, but to understand it. They measured angles. They studied stone placement. They traced the path of wind around its walls. The hut became a reference point. When storms come, people said, "This is what endures." Children born long after Alara's time never knew panic. To them, winter was powerful, but predictable. Homes were built low and strong. Fires were efficient. Shelters were shared when needed. The stone hut stood quietly, no longer strange, no longer unique. It had changed what normal meant. Decades later, another blizzard arrived, violent, sudden, relentless. Snow erased roads. Wind flattened forests beyond the valley. Inside the valley, people gathered in stone homes, calm and prepared. When the storm ended, the damage stopped at the borders. The lesson held. They never remembered Alara as someone who argued. They remembered her as someone who built. The hut remained at the edge of the valley, not as a monument, but as proof. That foresight outlasts doubt. That strength doesn't need permission. That storms don't care about opinions, only preparation. Decades passed quietly. Wooden buildings were repaired, replaced, and rebuilt. Names on doorways changed. Families came and went. The stone hut remained. Its edges softened slightly from wind and snow, but its structure never weakened. Time marked it, not with damage, but with respect. Engineers eventually came. They didn't arrive with arrogance. They arrived with notebooks, questions, and patience. They studied the valley's layout, the positioning of homes, and the way wind traveled through stone-lined paths. What began as one hut became a system. Other regions adopted the same principles. Valleys once damaged by winter learned to endure it. The stone hut was never locked. People stepped inside when storms threatened or when silence was needed. No rules were posted. No ownership claimed. Inside, the air felt steady, calm. Some said it was the stone. Others said it was memory. Eventually, no one pointed out the hut anymore. It blended into the valley, no longer remarkable, because everything else had grown stronger too. That was its final success. When resilience becomes ordinary, fear has no place to grow. Few remembered Alara's face, but everyone remembered the choice she made. To build slowly, to ignore laughter, to prepare for what was coming. The hut remained, not to be admired, but to be trusted. The storm arrived without warning. No dark horizon, no restless animals, just a sudden drop in temperature and a wind that came from a direction no one expected. It was the kind of storm that punished complacency. But the valley did not panic. Paths filled with snow, but remained passable. Stone walls redirected wind instead of fighting it. Fires were lit early and managed carefully. The valley functioned, not because the storm was weak, but because preparation had become instinct. The stone hut stood where it always had, untouched by urgency. Young builders worked through the night, reinforcing structures and checking on neighbors. They had learned from stories, not from fear. They didn't know Alara, but they knew her decisions. And that was enough. The storm ended as suddenly as it began. Snow lay deep but evenly. Damage was minor. Life resumed without ceremony. People didn't gather to count losses. They gathered to share warmth and food. No one spoke of the stone hut that day. It no longer needed to be mentioned. Its lesson had been absorbed into the valley itself, into every wall, every roof, every calm decision made in the face of winter. The hut remained. For the first time, people paid attention to the hut outside winter. In spring, water flowed around its stone base without eroding it. In summer, its interior stayed cool and dry. In autumn, leaves gathered gently against its walls. It wasn't just stormproof. It was time-proof. New structures in the valley were judged quietly, not by appearance, not by speed, but by one question: would this stand like the hut? If the answer was no, it wasn't finished. The stone hut received no visitors now. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had been accepted completely. People trusted it the way they trusted the ground beneath their feet. Silence became its highest form of praise. The valley changed subtly. Wind moved differently. Snow settled more evenly. Water drained without violence. Structures no longer fought the environment. They worked with it. The hut had taught balance, not dominance. Long after names faded from memory, the shape of the hut remained familiar. Low, solid, unassuming. A reminder that the strongest decisions often look small at first and are laughed at until they prove themselves. There came a winter unlike the others. No great storms. No record-breaking cold. Just steady snow and long nights. For the first time, the valley faced winter without challenge. And yet, it remained ready. People noticed something unusual. Preparation no longer felt reactive. Walls were maintained out of habit, not fear. Fires were managed with care, not urgency. Strength had become part of daily life. The stone hut stood not as a shield, but as a standard. Children learned the story without drama. They heard about laughter, about storms, about stone. But it sounded distant, almost unreal. To them, strong homes were normal. The hut was simply where it all began. No one inherited the hut. They inherited the mindset. Build for what lasts. Respect what you face. Prepare before you are tested. Those lessons outlived any structure. At the edge of the valley, the stone hut still stood. It did not demand attention. It did not need explanation. It existed as proof that one quiet choice, made against laughter, can change everything. Beyond the valley, the climate changed. Winters grew less predictable. Storms came harder, faster, and stranger. Regions once untouched by severe cold began to struggle. Travelers returned with stories of collapse. The valley listened, but did not panic. No single rule explained why the valley endured. Homes were low. Walls were thick. Communities stayed close. People didn't call it strategy. They called it normal. The stone hut remained the quiet origin of that normal. Snow fell heavier than usual that year. Wind tested angles. Ice pressed against walls. The hut responded the same way it always had, by doing nothing at all. Its strength was not reaction. It was acceptance. Scholars eventually arrived. They brought instruments, theories, and questions. They spoke of resilience, sustainability, and long-term design. The valley listened politely. They already knew the answers. No one remembered the day Alara laid the first stone, but everyone lived by the result. The hut stood where laughter once echoed, now replaced by understanding. One choice had become a foundation for generations. Over time, other places began to look like the valley. Stone replaced fragile materials. Homes followed the land instead of fighting it. Communities planned years ahead instead of seasons. The valley was no longer an exception. It had become an example. No one taught resilience directly. It was absorbed through repetition, through winters that passed quietly, through storms that failed to leave scars. The stone hut remained, not as instruction, but as confirmation. People noticed they no longer checked forecasts obsessively. They listened, prepared, and lived. Fear had been replaced by confidence. Not arrogance, but calm assurance. The kind that comes from being ready long before it matters. There were no debates about materials. No arguments about cost or speed. The answers were already standing. The hut had proven everything that needed proof decades ago. Snow fell again. Wind passed through the valley. Life continued. At the edge of it all, the stone hut still stood. Unchanged, unquestioned, and entirely at peace with the world around it. Over time, the valley itself carried the story. Not in words or records, but in the way paths curved, how buildings leaned into the wind, how stone guided water and snow. Memory no longer lived in people alone. It lived in the land. Few could name who built the stone hut anymore. It no longer mattered. The hut existed beyond identity, defined not by its maker, but by its purpose. It stood because it worked. Generations grew up without ever questioning winter. They respected it. They prepared for it. They lived alongside it. What once required courage now required only habit. No renovations were made to the hut. No reinforcements. No upgrades. It remained exactly as it had been built. Proof that good decisions don't need correction. At the edge of the valley, stone met sky. The hut stood there, unchanged as seasons passed beneath it. Not dramatic, not celebrated, just permanent. There came a winter so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. Snow fell gently. Wind moved softly across the valley. Life continued without interruption. And yet, this was the greatest proof of all. The storms no longer defined the valley. The valley defined how storms were met. The stone hut did not demand maintenance. It did not ask to be remembered. It simply remained, doing exactly what it had always done. Holding, protecting, enduring. No one spoke of resilience anymore. It had become invisible, woven into daily life, into architecture, into instinct. The strongest systems no longer announced themselves. They were quietly. If you listened carefully, you could almost imagine it. The distant echo of laughter from a time when the hut was new, strange, and doubted. But the echo faded quickly. Stone does not respond to laughter. It responds to time. At the edge of the valley, the stone hut still stands. Not as a monument, not as a warning, but as a simple truth made solid. Build for what is coming, not for what is easy. Prepare before you're tested. Let time be the judge. And time at last had spoken.